Today we're going to talk about Lesson 3 and the Spanish-American War. So first, we need to do a little background. The Spanish have taken over Cuba and ruled them for centuries. And of course, the people of Cuba do not appreciate being ruled by an outside force. So there was a lot of rebellion going on in Cuba, trying to get them to leave. And of course, the Spanish did not want to give up Cuba, so they would punish them pretty severely and put a lot of restrictions on them. So the Cubans were suffering quite a bit, a lot of starvation and bad conditions led to a lot of disease too. So the Cubans are not being treated very well by the Spanish in an effort to stop them from rebelling. So there are Americans who are worried about this. Sometimes it's because they hear about the bad treatment of the Cuban people, but a lot of times it is more about Americans being worried about their own interests. There were a lot of business owners who had property and a lot of business trade with Cuba that they were worried about what would happen for their economic interests. And then also some people were worried because Cuba is very close to the United States. What could happen if there's such a big problem and a rebellion going on there, and how might it affect us? So news of these struggles came to the United States through the press, and there were two very big newspapers at the time who are trying to outdo each other and try to sell the most newspapers. One was called The World, and this newspaper was owned by Joseph Pulitzer, and yes, that's the Pulitzer Prize gets named after him later. And William Randolph Hearst, you've probably heard of Hearst Castle, he owned the Journal. Okay, and these two owners are trying to outdo each other to sell the most papers. And so their articles got more and more shocking, perhaps even exaggerating and not telling the whole truth. They also kind of had an agenda. They both thought that the U.S. should intervene and get involved in Cuba and send our military there, and they were encouraging that and trying to make the public agree with them, right, by maybe exaggerating the facts so people would expect the government to do this military involvement. So that reporting is called yellow journalism, and the reason it's called yellow journalism is kind of a very long, convoluted story. There was a popular cartoon strip at the time called The Yellow Kid, and it used yellow ink in it. And so when people were talking about where they saw these articles, they would say, oh, it was in the newspaper, with the yellow kid, right? So, the one with the yellow. So it became, this kind of reporting was named after that. So it became yellow journalism because both of these articles, the cartoon strip was sold to both of these two papers. Nowadays, for so long, most of the time, journalism is not supposed to do this. The whole point of journalism is they're supposed to report the facts and tell you the news without trying to shape your opinion. However, these were definitely trying to kind of sway people, and sadly, today, it seems that more and more places say they're news, but really they're not true news, and they're more about trying to sway people to an opinion. And now that we have so many cable news stations, and of course internet sites. There are so many, and that's why you as a citizen need to be very careful to consider your sources of what you're reading and educate yourself about what their agenda might be and what are they, swaying the facts. It's very difficult. You have to be very careful to try to only read articles or watch news that you think is not biased, and it's hard because they don't want you to know that it's not the truth, and it really is swaying elections, and people are falling for it. So be careful. Try to find ones that are in the middle. There's a big diagram about I think I've showed it to you before, right? About where the different news sources lie on the being very liberal or being very conservative, right? And so you should kind of know where your news is coming from, and the best are in the middle, right? That aren't swaying one way or the other. Okay, anyway, back to this. So the public is starting to say, yes, we should go get involved in Cuba. This is terrible how they're treating them. Those Spanish are terrible. And people are feeling that way. And then something happens that really makes it worse. There was a battleship that McKinley sent to Havana, Cuba. The battleship was called the USS Maine. And it was sent there to protect American citizens that lived there or their property, right? Those business owners. And so, unfortunately, while it was there, this ship blew up. And of course, the newspapers blamed the Spanish and said it was their fault. And, you can understand why they would think it might be. Much, much later, they do think, based on the evidence, that perhaps it was just an accident. But it doesn't matter, because at that point, the news was portraying it as the Spanish fault, and people were already so upset with Spain that they were really saying that they wanted to go to war and telling McKinley to do that. There was a slogan called "Remember the Maine," and you can see there's a button that people would put on their shirt to try to say, right, like, we're not going to let those people die in vain, right? We're going to go stop these Spanish who are being so terrible, right? And so Congress did end up declaring war on Spain in 1898. And so we get in this big war, and it's called the Spanish-American War. Even though Cuba is what set it off, right, when we finally got in the war, interestingly, we did not fight in Cuba first. There were other Spanish territories, right, that we ended up fighting in, like the Philippines. Okay, so remember how all the different countries are competing for islands that are good for stopping points to go to Asia and China, right? So the Philippines is one of these. And the colony of the Philippines is controlled by the Spanish. And so we actually go and fight them there in Manila Bay. We sent a surprise attack there, and we did well, the Americans, right? We destroyed a lot of their ships. And then we send also troops over a little bit later, and there are people in the Philippines who do not want the Spanish to control them anymore, right? So they want their independence. So these rebels, Filipino rebels, notice, by the way, when you spell Philippines, the place, it's a PH, but when you say the people, it's an F. It's an interesting thing. Okay? So Emilio Aguinaldo was the leader of the rebels, and he makes a deal, and he says, we'll help you fight against the Spanish, and they're expecting that when they win, they will get their independence from the Spanish. So they go ahead and help, and they get the city of Manila and another island, and they say, great, here we go, we won, we're going to be independent. Unfortunately for them, the U.S. was like, well, actually, the Philippines are a really good stopping place for China. Maybe we shouldn't let them have independence, right? So we'll get back to that in a second. In the meantime, things have started fighting in Cuba. So we are in Santiago, Cuba, in the harbor there, and some American ships are trapped and troops. So we send a lot of troops over to try to fight. And again, the Cubans are fighting against the Spanish, right? And a lot of the troops are African American. So as you can imagine, in this time, right, late 1800s, early 1900s, there are not a lot of rights still for African Americans, so they're treated badly, right? Okay, and one of the other people that fought in Cuba was Theodore Roosevelt, and he made a group called the Rough Riders. So now here's the thing, your book had already mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, because remember how your book likes to stay on topics and they don't go always in order. So we had already talked about Theodore Roosevelt in the last chapter, last lesson, because we had mentioned him as president when he helped stop the war between Japan and Russia. Remember, and he had that meeting and he got a treaty. So that they went ahead in time. So we are back to before that, all right? So sorry, it goes back and forth. But McKinley's the president, right, during the Spanish-American War. And Theodore Roosevelt was younger. He was in the Navy. And then he decides he's going to lead these volunteers of college students and other, like, people who can ride, right, cowhands. And they go, and they're called the Rough Riders. And they go and they fight with the African Americans and other soldiers. And they have this really famous battle called the Battle of San Juan Hill. And it's a really terrible battle, and it's a lot of, death and fighting. And finally, though, the U.S. wins this battle of this hill, and also then the Navy does well against the Spanish fleet and stops them from leaving and destroys them. And basically, that's the end of the Spanish resistance in Cuba. Okay. So then, of course, the fighting is not done because there's other colonies owned by Spain. And so you can see on the map, hopefully, the lands that we're talking about. We fight in Puerto Rico. So we send more troops over to Puerto Rico, and we get that. And after we capture Puerto Rico, then that is going to be the end. They go and make a truce, or they use the fancy word armistice, which is a stop until you make your final, you stop fighting until you make your treaty, right? And so the war is going to be over. So interestingly, the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, calls this war a splendid little war. And that might sound bad, right? Because people did die. But from his point of view, in only 4 months, it's a very short war, right? And only 400 Americans actually died from fighting. Now, that's not the whole death count. There were more who died from diseases, right? They're fighting in tropical areas. Yellow fever, malaria, things like that are going to cause some other deaths too. But overall, that's not too much of a cost for what they are going to get. So that's why he's saying it's a splendid little war from his point of view. It's very short and sweet, and he got what he wanted, right? Now, the other thing to remember is African Americans, even though he's saying it's a good war, it wasn't really great for them, right? Because they often did not get the respect, treatment they deserved either. Okay, so the reason he thinks it's such a great war is not only are we going to get some land, but now we are recognized as having a great military, and we are proving our mettle, right? And we're taking over all this land, and we're showing that we can have all these, impacts in foreign places, and we're going to, get that imperialism that we want. Okay. All right, so what lands do we get? So first of all, it's called the Treaty of Paris. Surprise, surprise, right? And the Spanish Empire gets broken up, and we get quite a bit of it. Cuba is going to be, it's called a protectorate because we do not own it. It is still its own independent country. However, we have a lot of say in what happens in Cuba for quite a long time. Puerto Rico and Guam are actually going to become our territories, and they still are today, and they still, we'll talk about this, they never became full states, even though the people are U.S. citizens. And that one we agreed to pay for the next thing, the Philippines. So we have Cuba, we have Puerto Rico and Guam, and we have the Philippines. And we paid $20 million to get the Philippines because, again, it's such a great stopping place, right, that we want, and there's good bases and things. So why don't we have them all now? Well, there was something that we made in Cuba, since it wasn't really ours, it was a protectorate. We passed something in 1901 called the Platt Amendment. And basically we said, oh yeah, you're independent and everything, but we want a base here, right? Guantanamo Bay, which we still have today. And also we want to be involved. We don't want you making any treaties with other countries. You're so close to us, and what you do affects us too, and so we're not allowed to go making treaties with other countries. So we're still being heavy-handed in them, and we're even saying if we feel like your independence is threatened, we can come in with our military again, right? So it is freedom for Cuba, but still we're, going to be very heavy-handed about it. Okay. And then Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, we are controlling it. It is a territory. In 1917, a little bit later, the Jones Act said that the Puerto Ricans are all American citizens, and that is still how it is today. There are Americans who live in Puerto Rico, but they do not enjoy the full rights. Well, we can talk about that later, about some of the things they can't do, but there are some limitations, and there are quite a few people who think that we should not still control Puerto Rico. It should be independent. All right, and then the Philippines. So we don't own or control the Philippines anymore. So what happened with that? Well, we're not going to talk really about, well, let's just do the quick version. So it was a big debate. There's an anti-imperialists, the people who don't think we should be taking over these places, thought that this was terrible, that, the Filipino people, right, fought for their independence. Remember, the rebels thought that they were going to get their independence, and they helped us fight, and now we're just not giving it to them. So there are a lot of people who thought that that was not good. There's also another group of anti-imperialist people who don't want to take it because they thought that, it'll be too expensive and too hard on us to have troops there to keep control of the island, right, about these Filipinos who want independence and other maybe European countries who might want it. Also, the third reason is the laborers, Filipino laborers will work for really cheap. And some people were worried that that would make it hard to compete with American goods, and because Americans can't work as cheap as Filipino people. So there's a variety of reasons why people didn't like it. And Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain are two of the famous people who were trying to talk out against it and saying the pictures are on the left there. And then, of course, there's a whole group of people called the imperialists, the people who do want to have control of Philippines, that say, no, this is what we need. We need this stopover on the way to China. It's a naval base. We can sell our goods there, right? There's also that group of people who want to bring religion and think that they're less civilized than us, and we need to go civilize them, and we'll help them. And so basically, we decided we were going to make them a U.S. territory in the Treaty of Paris, right? And that was a hard decision, and it really was hard on us to keep them. Remember, the Filipinos wanted their independence, and they're not willing to stop. And so they keep fighting us now while we're trying to control them. And so we do have to send soldiers there, and a lot of them die, way more than the original war. 4,000 die, and mostly, sadly, a lot of Filipinos die, not just from fighting, but also their conditions, right? From disease and hunger. So there is a very long history of fighting against Americans there, and I'm just going to skip to the end that eventually, of course, they do get their independence from us in 1946. So I don't know if you know that we controlled the Philippines for so long, but of course we don't anymore.